I'm Grace Whitman, 32 years old. And that morning, I didn't yet know that my identity, my past, and everything I thought I belonged to would be behind a door. As I walked slowly up the stairs of my apartment building, I had a strange feeling. It wasn't fear, not really. It was more of an intuitive emptiness. It was as if my feet were stepping not on concrete, but on uncertainty. That morning, everything seemed as it should be. The air was cool, but not sharp. The sky gray, but not threatening. It was as if even nature had chosen to remain neutral. When I got to the door, I took the key out of my bag. As usual, it was stuck in the bottom corner of the bag. When I picked it up, I recognized the metal immediately, the small scratch on it, the slightly rusted tip, the spinning motion I had been turning for years. But that day, that familiarity did not comfort me. On the contrary, it made me shiver. I put the key in the lock. My hand did not tremble, but a silence echoed inside me that is hard to describe. It was as if everything was so loud, but I couldn't hear a word. I turned the key. It turned empty. At first, I didn't understand. Then I tried again. Same result. The key wouldn't meet the lock, as if the lock didn't recognize me, as if it was silently saying, "This is not your place anymore." A sound came from inside, a clear footstep, a sole on the carpet, close. But then silence again. The lock still hasn't been unlocked. No one came, no explanation, just silence. Just then, the door of a dark gray SUV on the opposite sidewalk opened. I slowly turned my head, and it wasn't hard to recognize the silhouette emerging from the car, Evelyn Whitman, my mother. At that moment, my heart seemed to stop beating inside me. I was breathing, but I didn't want to inhale the air. She was wearing a wide black lace hat, just like at my father's funeral. It was as if time had stopped. We had said goodbye there that day, with that hat, and now there he was again, the same expression, the same blank stare. He was holding a yellow envelope, not like a postman, like he was carrying an obituary. The wind blew her hair in her face, but she didn't move a muscle. He stared at me. His eyes were dry, as if he had calculated everything in advance. She hadn't cried. He wasn't going to cry. If she had a heart, she had no door left to open for me. He came up to me. She moved her lips, but I seemed to know what she was going to say before her voice came out. "Grace, I didn't want it to be this way," he said. The sentence hung in the air. It was the first sentence that hit me, like a slap. Then he handed me the yellow envelope. My hand was sweaty, but it felt like ice holding that envelope. That was the second slap. He turned back, closed the door of the SUV. He got in and drove away without looking back once. That was the third slap. I stood there, not a word spilled from my tongue, not a tear rolled down my cheek. I turned back to the door and tried to turn the key again, but my hand wouldn't move. My fingers no longer wanted to hold it, because I realized that I no longer had a place beyond that door, that there was no chair that belonged to me. I didn't even look at the envelope, because I guessed its contents, maybe a court order, maybe a notary document. But whatever it was the very thing that had locked me out. I was left standing on the sidewalk with a metal key and a yellow envelope in my hand. It was as if the world kept flowing, but I was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. And in that moment, there was only one sentence echoing inside me. Loss doesn't only come with death. Sometimes people bury you alive. Sometimes they erase you alive, without even leaving a tombstone behind. No past, no future, just nothingness. And I felt it that day, not for the first time, but deeply. This was not just the closing of a door. It was the beginning of a story I could not get out of. From the outside, the yellow envelope I held in my hand looked like an ordinary document, but I knew what to expect. Or rather, my heart knew. My mind was still clinging to the possibility that something had been misunderstood. I couldn't go home. The door had locked me out. But the envelope in my hand was still something from that house. My last connection, my last delusion. I walked into the little cafe on the street corner, the place where Elizabeth and I used to come for breakfast on Sunday mornings, filled with laughter, reading books, and making each other dream. Now, only their shadows remained. The place was almost empty. The silence was broken by the intermittent hum of the coffee machine. The young man at the counter bowed his head slightly without looking me in the eye. I sat quietly at the corner table by the window. I didn't want to order, but soon a filter coffee arrived. The waiter didn't ask me how long I hadn't been there. I'm glad he didn't, because I wouldn't have an answer. The envelope was still in my hand. I stared at it for a few seconds before opening it, as if it contained a bullet, not a document. I felt I wasn't ready, but there was no point in running anymore. I slowly opened the envelope, and out came a folded sheet of paper and a tiny card. I reached for the card first, and I recognized my father's familiar handwriting. Those sharp, angular letters. I remembered the notes he wrote on every birthday, after every achievement, the little traces of pride he left in the margins of that notebook. But this time, it wasn't like that. I hope you find a new path for yourself. It unties the bonds of the past. D. Whitman. The sentences I read were short but deadly. This was not a lecture. It was not a farewell letter. It was a stamped exclusion, an official erasure, untying the bonds of the past. So I wasn't even part of the past anymore. I put the card down on the table and turned to the paper. I held my breath for a moment as my fingers gripped the edges of the paper. I closed my eyes before I started reading, hoping against hope that the writing would disappear when I opened them. But when I opened them, it was all there, cold, flat, sharp. The document was an official notice. It said, "Ownership arrangement and declaration of inheritance." The house of my childhood, was registered in my father's name, and after his death, the property rights passed to Evelyn Whitman and Elizabeth Whitman. They were informing me that they had completely disinherited me. And the reason was this: Grace Whitman shall be deemed to have waived all rights of ownership and inheritance due to her incompatible behavior and conduct detrimental to the family reputation. Disorderly conduct. According to whom? What was nonconformity? Forging your own path? Questioning their truth? Did I really hurt the family, or was I just too honest to keep the family secret? My eye lingered on one line. Perhaps it was the most painful. Grace Whitman's right to reside in the family home is terminated. The keys are hereby revoked. The keys. That piece of metal that I held in my hand in the morning, that I had carried in my pocket for years. It was no longer of any use. Not legally, not symbolically. I felt something rising up from my stomach, not vomiting, not crying. Like a wave. It came up to my throat, but not a single word came out of my mouth. I was silent. I couldn't even scream, because that paper had already said everything. I just sat there at the table, a card, a document, and a coffee that was now cold. My mind was opening and closing scenes from my childhood, my father buying me my first bicycle, my mother smiling as she braided my hair one morning that Sunday when Elizabeth and I fought, but then hugged and laughed. It all felt fake. Or the past was like rewatching a movie that didn't belong to me. I wasn't an actor, but an extra. I asked myself, what do you do now? At that moment, only one name came to me: Claire, my old roommate, the silent heroine of my college years, the only person who shared my pillow on hard days, who listened to me, who didn't judge me. I hadn't reached out to her in years, but I had no one else. I pulled out my phone. I remembered her number by heart. I dialed it, my heart racing. After a few rings, she picked up. "Grace," he said. His voice was still the same. Familiar, but there was a vague distance in it. "It's me," I said in a low voice. "I need a temporary place." There was silence. No yes, no no. But as someone who knows me, I felt in my heart what the answer was, because some friendships, even when dust settles on them, remain rooted. And me, that day in that cafe, that morning when my life was officially excluded, it was there that I realized for the first time that starting over was actually a kind of revenge. Claire didn't question me, neither did she say what happened, nor why. She just sent me a short text. "Come, the sofa is still where it was." When I received that message, something inside me lifted like a memory that had been gathering dust for years. This sentence was like an echo of those years when we once stood back to back, holding on to each other's breath in the dark. The sofa still in its old place meant that I was still here, and I didn't need anything else at that moment. That night in Claire's living room, I sat on the dark green velvet sofa. I say I sat because I can't say I slept. I may have closed my eyes, but my soul was awake. I tripped over the crack in the corner of the ceiling, a thin, sinuous vein running down from top to bottom. Even that crack felt like it belonged to me. It was as if the walls of the house cracked as I cracked, as if that line had heard and echoed the disintegration inside me even when I wasn't there. It didn't swallow me, but it was there, like a silent witness. I created a strange consolation for myself at that moment. Tonight I am here. Tomorrow, who knows where I am? But at least someone opened the door for me. The night was long, because thoughts are not short, because rejection is heavier than sleep. In the morning, Claire came to me without asking any questions, holding 2 mugs. One of the mugs was my old mug, white with "Shut up, I'm writing," written in red. The one we bought when we were in college and used until the writing was erased in the dishwasher. The fact that he still had it, he didn't need to say anything else. He handed me the mug. "Do you want to tell me?" he asked. His voice was soft, as if he didn't expect an answer. He was just giving permission. "Not yet," I said. But my eyes were saying more than telling, because some things can only be conveyed with a look, and some people know that you cry without shedding a tear. There was silence in the hall as I sipped the coffee. There was the sound of traffic outside, but inside another world was being built. Claire didn't sit next to me. She stood next to me. And then she took her own mug and went to her room. She didn't draw boundaries, didn't impose intimacy. She was just there. And that moment was enough for me. When Claire went to work, the house was quiet. But this silence wasn't like in the cafe. It was peaceful. She wasn't pressing me or judging me. A folded blanket in the corner of the living room, 2 books on the coffee table, a wilted flower by the window. All familiar. They all knew me. I sat back on the couch, staring into space with the still warm mug in my hand. I don't know if it was a few minutes or an hour. But then something happened. An impulse rose up inside me, like a call. It was as if my own inner voice was saying, "Get back to yourself." I went to Claire's bookshelf and pulled out an empty notebook. A yellowed leaf was stuck in the margin. I opened to the first page. The pen didn't tremble in my hand. The first sentence I wrote was, "I've been erased, but I can still write." Writing. What once kept me alive. My passion that even my father once called empty work and my mother called not enough on its own. I've always written. I've written things I couldn't even admit to myself. But then I kept silent. I kept silent because I was afraid of not being loved, of not being liked, of being too much. I took my old laptop out of my bag. As I plugged in the charging cable, I realized I still knew where the plug was by heart. I opened the lid, and a few seconds passed before the dusty screen recovered itself. When I reached the main screen, my eye got stuck on one of the folders, Road Notes. I opened it. Inside were short writings from years ago, story drafts, unfinished novel entries. I looked at them all, one by one, and I didn't feel like a stranger. On the contrary, it was still mine. No one had been able to get me out of there. Not a notarized document, not an envelope, not a court order. It was still me. Laptop on my lap, couch under me, coffee beside me. That was the first time I really breathed. The first title came to my mind, The Key to a Door That Won't Turn. I started writing, and with each sentence I was a little more alive. Someone might have erased me, but I was still the only one who could write my story, and no one could take that away from me. It had been 3 weeks since I moved into Claire's house. The couch still left marks on my back, but I was grateful for that. At least I was under a warm roof, drinking coffee from the same mug every morning, staring at the same crack every night. My mind was a mess, but my body was safe. It was a harbor, albeit a temporary one. That morning, Claire had gone to work early, as usual. I was home alone, bent over the keyboard in the middle of an unfinished piece of writing, when my phone vibrated. A message from Claire. "An envelope came for you. I left it on the table." My first reaction was surprise. Who would know I was at this address? Who would use my name anymore? But then a strange heaviness came over me. I got up and walked towards the envelope. It was sitting on the table, different from the other documents. The writing on it was cold and familiar. Whitman and Partners Law Firm. At that moment, my heart gripped the arm of the chair. I knew this name very well, the law firm where my father had worked for years, where our family had carved his name under every stone. When I visited their office as a child, they used to hand me a lollipop. Now, what came in that envelope was not a lollipop, but a knife. My hand didn't tremble when I touched the envelope, but the storm inside me had turned into a hurricane in my palm. I opened it. Inside was a thick stack of documents, an official letter, a few attachments, and a summary. My stomach slowly clenched as my eyes scanned the top lines. The division of the inheritance was complete. It was official. There was nothing left. The house, the summer house, bank accounts, the vineyard, every asset, every detail was documented, divided equally between Evelyn Whitman and Elizabeth Whitman. And me? I was only mentioned once in the document. I was neither heir nor beneficiary. There was only one description next to my name: non-party. Those two words shattered the last shred of my heart. Nonpartisan, as if I had no ties, as if I no longer existed. "No," I whispered inside. "No. I am the daughter of this family. I was the child who ran up and down the stairs of that house. I buried my first poem under the plum tree in the garden. There were evenings when my father and I would sit on the porch and drink tea. When I gave my mother the scarf I sewed myself for her birthday, her eyes filled with tears. All this, all of it. What had happened now? Was it erased with the stroke of a pen? Was I ignored, forgotten, or deliberately excluded? I blacked out for a moment. Not tears, not anger either. A kind of emptiness. And then spontaneously my hand reached for my notebook. I opened the notebook on my knees. My pen wrote a single sentence that night. "They ignored me, but I will prove that I exist." As I wrote that sentence for the first time, I recognized myself again. This was not anger. It was determination. Because sometimes you can destroy a person just by turning your back on them. But sometimes that person learns to erect their own spine when there is no one to lean on. That night, I closed my laptop. I didn't write. I just thought. I didn't plan. I didn't strategize. I just sat. And for the first time, I thought about the future. Revenge. As they say, revenge is a dish best eaten cold. I had every intention of cooking that dish, but I hadn't even turned on the stove. I hadn't prepared the plate yet, because first I had to stand firm. I had to stand, I had to be reborn. And then I had to put that food, in all its coolness, in front of them. But first I had to set a table for myself. I was excluded from one life, but I was determined to build another. Elizabeth, my sister, the person I first envied, then admired, then couldn't make sense of, and finally didn't recognize. If I had to describe her, I would say the one who never did anything wrong. His hair was always neat. He even wore his school uniform ironed. His notebook covers were clean, and his writing was neat. His voice never rose or fell. I don't even remember him crying. He had a smile, but no laughter. He smiled, but there was never a relaxation on his face that oozed sincerity. And me? I was a mess. I would stain my shirt while eating, get a 3 in math, and then write page after page in my notebook why I got a 3. I'd ask questions. Why is it like this? But I don't feel that way, I would say. My sentences were not objections, just my inner voice. But to my mother, Elizabeth was strong, and I was fragile. My father told Elizabeth, "You'll manage, girl." He preferred to tell me to be patient. Over the years, this dynamic hasn't changed, but I changed. Elizabeth refused to change. She was always in the window. She was front and center in the family album. Me? In the storage room behind the window. A little more fuzzy, a little more in the shadows. The first time I noticed it was the day I graduated from college. My father wore the same cufflinks to the ceremony that Elizabeth wore to her college graduation. "It's good luck," he said, but he didn't show them to me. When the ceremony was over, he hugged me and said, "I'm so proud of you." But there was no tone of confidence in his voice. I felt it in that moment. But I still loved Elizabeth, because we grew up in the same room as children. She was the only one who could say, "I'm not asleep, don't be afraid," when I was scared at night. One day at school, when someone called me ugly, Elizabeth came home, combed my hair, and said, "There is no one with a smile like your eyes." It's hard to forget those moments. That's why when you see her name on the inheritance papers and read mine only as non-party, when not only my family erased me, but he erased me too, something else inside me broke. I thought about it for a long time. Was there still a connection between us? Maybe Elizabeth had unknowingly left a crumb inside her. Maybe it was just my parents' decision. Maybe. And in that hope, I texted. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't start a fight. I just wrote one sentence. "Can we talk? Face to face." The answer came in 3 words. Go through the official channels. Cold, short, precise. The first thing that went through my mind when I got that message was, she's one of them now. She's not my sister anymore. She's not family anymore. Now he's just a legal figure, going through the official channels, as if I was a stranger. It was as if someone on the street came and tried to enter the house, and Elizabeth said, "Please follow the legal process," through the door. That's when I realized this. There was always a shadow behind Elizabeth's smile. I realized this years later, watching my own life from the outside. She wasn't making mistakes because she hadn't been given that right. The family had invested in her perfection. They had crafted her like a shining jewel in a showcase. But jewelry wears out over time. It gets dusty. It breaks. I was never in that showcase, but I don't want to stay broken behind the window anymore. After that message, I opened my notebook. I looked at the white page for a long time. Then I wrote, "Elizabeth, I will no longer stay in your shadow. You have denied me, but I will rebuild my name, this time alone." For a while I waited for the spark from Elizabeth, but there isn't one. And now I know. That spark is inside me. I will light it with my own hands, and this time it won't just illuminate, it will destroy. When Claire walked through the door that evening, she had an unusual expression on her face. Not anger, not surprise, not happiness. She had found something, and it seemed to have thrown her off balance. He handed me the small USB stick he was holding. "Stay calm, but you have to see this," he said. Something stirred inside me. Some kind of intuition, a woman's instinct, a memory of the past. I don't know. But I was sure there was something about me on that USB. We sat down at the table and I opened my laptop. I inserted the drive, my fingers trembling a little. A folder opened. W&G internal data. Subfolders, records, deeds, contacts, documents. My throat went dry as my eyes darted through the documents. Excel spreadsheets, property transfer documents in PDF format, digitized emails. Each one was registered with a timestamp. It all added up to a bizarre scenario. Claire opened one of the documents and pointed to the screen. "Look at this date," she said. I did. It was about 4 months before my father's death. The deed had been transferred. To whom? To Elizabeth. Claire continued. "This transfer coincides almost exactly with the date you actually left the family home. So Grace, before they closed that door on you, they had planned it." Suddenly, a wall of cold rose up inside me, like a frozen sea. Not the feeling, the thought froze, because what I was feeling was no longer sadness. This was outright betrayal, and it was documented. Claire had studied law. She never became a prosecutor or a lawyer, but she always knew the language of order. She spoke without taking her eyes off the computer. "These are, let me be clear, irregularities. This deed to Elizabeth was signed before the inheritance was transferred, without documentation of the father's mental health. Moreover, the notary's signature is missing. There are date discrepancies in several places. I held the screen with my hand, as if it would fall, as if the truth would escape my grasp like a slippery stone. But it wasn't. It was there. It was on the record. I was no longer just an excluded member of this family, but a deliberately purged member. My eyes slowly drifted to the emails. They were correspondence between Elizabeth and my father's former accountant, polite but harsh between the lines. These transactions should be completed after Grace's situation has been clarified. Are you sure? The formal inheritance process has not yet begun. And Elizabeth's reply, time is of the essence. Let's be prepared. Let's take the necessary steps in advance. Let's be prepared. It was true that they caught me off guard, but now it's my turn. Claire was silent. We didn't speak for a while. I watched the screen. She watched me. Then my lips moved. So, I said, they took me out of the game a long time ago. Claire nodded slowly. Yes, you thought that was the day you said goodbye to the stage, but the backstage was closed weeks ago. A spark rose inside me, like anger, but deeper. This kind of anger doesn't shout. This anger is not directed at itself. It is a quiet determination. It is cold. It's clear, locked on target. I opened my notebook that night, a white page. On one side I wrote only this sentence: silence is the loudest voice, and now I speak. Until that moment, I had only been an outcast. Now, with the documents I had captured in their hands, I saw that I was being erased. This was no longer just a personal resentment. It was an act of war. But I don't fight by shouting. I fight by watching. I fight by planning. I shoot my enemy with his weapon, and now I had their weapon, the truth, document, evidence. For the first time, I felt prepared, not helpless. Revenge was no longer a dream. It was a route. And I had plotted that route on the small USB stick Claire had left on my desk. I finally realized that the silence would not erase me. That evening, Claire and I were sitting in the kitchen. It was past midnight. It was quiet outside, but inside, the kitchen was like a war zone. The table was covered from top to bottom with documents, accounting statements, photocopies of deeds, time-stamped emails, notarized documents. The laptop was open. On the screen was the legal text Claire had prepared. In the silence of the moment, I was frowning and reading a yellowing document in my hand. At one point, I looked up. Claire looked at me. There was tiredness in her eyes, but a kind of solidarity shone underneath. "Are you sure?" she said, her eyes serious, her voice soft. The voice of a friend. I took a deep breath. I didn't answer right away. The words passed through my heart before they came to my mouth. Then I looked at him and said, "No, I'm not sure, but I'm not afraid anymore." Something changed with that sentence. Until that day, I had always tried to be sure. But now I knew that sometimes life can be walked without being sure. You can also take a step with fear, as long as you know your direction. And I knew my direction, like a woman looking straight into the mirror for the first time. I was seeing myself. That night we finished the brief on Claire's computer. She wrote it. I read every word. The title was simple but devastating: Wrongful Transfer of Inheritance Rights and Violation of Personal Rights. It was written line by line, how which property was transferred and on what date. My father's lack of medical certificates. Time conflicts in notarial records, and most importantly, documented evidence of the process of exclusion within the family. Maybe I was not a lawyer. But as I studied these documents, I was learning too. I was learning about the trial of my own life. Each date was like a scar. Every document was a nail in my side. But now I was removing those nails. In the morning I was tired, but determined. I got dressed. Simple pants, a simple jacket. I wanted to feel like a woman, understated, but standing up straight. When we arrived at the court, there was a strange silence inside me. No excitement, no panic. It was as if I had been waiting for this moment, and it was finally happening. Claire was next to me, documents in her hand, confidence in her eyes. I approached the court pen. The woman in charge looked up at me. "Case application?" she said. I reached into my bag. I took out the document Claire had prepared. I paused for a second. There was a slight sweat on my palms, but my hand didn't tremble. I reached for the pen. I wrote my name. I put the date under it. At that moment, something passed through me, a subtle but powerful feeling. It was as if I had just written my reply to the envelope I was given in the past. You know that yellow envelope they sent? The document with the words, "You have been evicted." This petition was her answer. I was no longer a silent victim, but a woman demanding her rights. Claire turned her head to me. "It's over," she said in a whisper. "No," I said. "This is just the beginning." When I left the courtroom, the air was cool, but for the first time it didn't feel like a chill. On the contrary, it felt like relief. For the first time, the invisible burden I had been carrying for years had loosened a little. It is not easy to sue my own family. Everyone knows that. But I was no longer part of that family. They had rejected me, and I was determined to shatter their sacred image, that fairy tale of the perfect Whitman family, in court. At that moment, a word came to me. I heard it in a movie years ago. Truth is the most powerful weapon, as long as you know how to hold it. I now had that truth in my hand. Now I was learning how to hold it. And this is not just a case. It was my life being taken back. When they found out they were being sued, the first thing they did was not talk. They shut up. My phone didn't ring. Neither my mother nor Elizabeth. I didn't expect a warm voice from them anyway, but even such an icy silence was surprising. It was as if for years they had been treating me as if I were just a legal figure. Not a daughter, not a sister, just a name that should no longer appear on documents. The first official response came 2 weeks later, a cold, technical document prepared by their lawyers. Our clients completely deny the allegations made by the plaintiff. The transactions in question were carried out in a completely legal framework. It is unethical to bring family matters to the judiciary. Moral? When I read that word, I laughed so hard that it echoed inside me, even though I couldn't speak out loud. Those who had systematically removed me from the family for years were now talking about morality? Weren't they the ones who kicked me out of the house, erased my name from the inheritance documents, didn't allow me to call my father even in his last days? Morality. They used it like a shield. They put lies on it and polished it. But I was planning to pierce that armor, slowly, patiently. This silence did more than create anger in me. It taught me something. Silence is the favorite tactic of criminals, because if they answer, they leave a trace. Every word that comes out of their mouths before the trial can be used as evidence against them in the future. That's why they keep silent. They defend themselves not with the law, but with silence. But I no longer belong to that order of silence. Every second I remained silent, I was becoming a part of that invisible order that worked in their favor. And I wanted to break that order now. I thought, should I have taken a more radical step? It's like going to the media, an interview, an article, maybe an anonymous leak. But then I was honest with myself. I wasn't ready yet. In the heat of battle, the one who draws his weapon early misses his target. I had to secure my ammunition first. Claire and I decided to gather more documents. Bank transactions made months before my father's death, shares of the company that had been irregularly transferred to Elizabeth, tax documents. All of them, when we put the pieces together, point to a single picture, a planned purge. It was planned to erase me not only from my family, but even from my past. My sleep at night was erratic. I often woke up at 3 a.m. and stared at the ceiling. There was only one sentence running through my head. If they're an army, I'm a strategy. A fear was growing inside me, and something else. A fire that is hard to define. Flammable, but not burning. It's like a fire that illuminates my insides, an emotion mixed with anger but with direction. It's more than revenge. like justice, but more personal. I opened my notebook. I made a new title that day. Silence, the loudest answer. I made a note under it. Their not speaking was not because they were silent. It was because they silenced me. Now it's my turn. Claire was by my side, as always. She was patient. She didn't get tired. Maybe she was looking for answers to her own past in the process. We didn't talk much some nights, but our silence was friendship. Two women who knew what it meant not to be a family in the same house, with different stories but in a common struggle. The trial date was approaching. It was a few weeks away. Was I ready? No, I wasn't. But that didn't stop me. Sometimes being ready is just a lie, because real battles are won not by preparation, but by determination. And I had made up my mind. I had Claire in front of me, my notebook in my hand, the past behind me. But only one goal in front of me, to show the truth, no matter what the cost. When I stepped through the courtroom door, my breath caught in my throat. Maybe my feet didn't tremble, but inside my heart seemed to have shifted. It was beating not in my chest, but in my neck. Every time it beat, it said, "You're here. You can't hide." It was colder inside than I thought. Not just the weather, but the atmosphere. The walls are plain, the benches are wooden, there is a seriousness in the air. Silence reigned inside, but even that silence was judgmental. Even the sound of pencils was too loud. I turned my eyes to the other side. Elizabeth, my sister. The girl I once grew up in the same room with, envied her clothes, tried to imitate her smile. Now she was a stranger. She was wearing a dark blue suit. I had already guessed. She always preferred dark colors for formal occasions, and her hair was not disheveled. It was carefully gathered. It was as if he had come to a business presentation that day, not to a court. She left all her emotions behind and carried only her image to the hall. But I knew him. The dullness on his face could not fool me. His jaw was slightly clenched. His eyes were always looking at a point close to the judge. But I knew the real sign. The pupils. I knew Elizabeth was scared when her pupils dilated. And that day, those pupils were fluttering in place like a secret. She was trying to look calm, but inside she was storming, like the shy fear she felt when I found her secret diary as a child. When the judge entered the courtroom, everyone stood up. Although everyone stood up in the same way, their intentions were different. Some out of respect, others out of obligation. Mine was something else. At that moment, I stood up for my life. As we sat down, our lawyer took the floor. A middle-aged, experienced woman Claire had introduced months before. Her name was Margaret. Her voice was neither soft nor harsh, but it was full. It was as if her sentences were not just words, but experiences. One by one, she presented our evidence: dates, signatures, email records. Each document was proof of my erasure, but it was also a witness. Witnesses who didn't have a say, but who didn't lie either. The other side, my mother and Elizabeth's lawyer, just politely characterized it as a family dispute. As if this should have been resolved in a family therapy room instead of a courtroom. As if I was just an over-emotional child. As if the documents were just a misunderstanding. But Margaret didn't back down. Our case was solid. The truth was louder than their silence. There was no verdict that day. The hearing was postponed. A new date was set. I left the courtroom with mixed emotions. But one thing was clear. For the first time, I felt strong. Alone, yes. Broken, yes. But strong. Because I was no longer carrying the fate that had been drawn for me, but my own pen. I may not have known what to write with that pen, but now it was in my hand. And in that moment, I realized I am Grace Whitman. I was defending not just an inheritance case, but my very existence, and I had taken the first step to win that battle. And now I was fighting to regain my identity, not just my surname. The court process was dragging on and on like time. But each passing day changed me a little more. As soon as I woke up in the morning, I would check the court calendar. Every envelope that arrived in the mailbox was no longer a threat, but data. I wrote down every sentence, every date, every footnote in my notebook, and then took notes for hours. I, who once wrote only stories, who made life with words. Now I was on a battlefield of documents, evidence, and laws. Yes, I was getting tired. Lack of sleep had deepened my facial lines. There were new wrinkles on my face and dark circles under my eyes. But when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw a weak woman. I saw someone shaken, but standing. That woman was me. That's what those who ignored me forgot. It was easy to tear me down, but not to erase me. Claire was still with me. Without her, this road would not have been so stone-free. At night, we sat at the living room table, drinking tea and analyzing email correspondence. We were sending petitions to offices and trying to get information from old acquaintances. "Grace," he was saying, "you are fighting not only for yourself, but for all those like you whose voices have been silenced." And these words kept me alive. Because he was right. I wasn't just after a house, a few bank accounts, a vineyard. I was asking for revenge for being ignored, for being treated as if I didn't exist. In the past, if someone said revenge to me, I would turn my head and walk away. But now I realized that revenge was not just about hurting someone. Sometimes revenge was about proving your existence again. Sometimes it was the loudest voice saying, "I am here." I had become the lawyer of my own life. I was a woman who scrutinized the signatures, statements, account transactions one by one, collecting documents, asking questions, not shutting up. And I had come to such a point that I was now preparing to face the truth not only in courtrooms, but also in the very center of those false paradises they had built for years. This was not just a trial. This was a reckoning. I was Grace Whitman, and this time they may have started the game, but I was going to write the ending. And for the first time, someone really wanted to hear me. One morning, I had no idea that an ordinary email would change my life. The message that landed in my inbox was short, but it meant a lot. "Hi, Grace. I heard your story and would love to hear from you if you want to talk. Lydia Marks, independent journalist." At first, I hesitated. I thought about it. I didn't want to give my pain to anyone. But there was something in Lydia's tone, not curiosity, but respect, not sensationalism, but understanding. One afternoon, we met in a quiet cafe. It was gray, just like that morning when the lock on the door wouldn't turn. But this time, the silence inside me was not a scream. It was impatient to be told something. Lydia asked me questions, looking me straight in the eye. She did not silence me, nor did she suppress my emotions. I told about my father's death, the famous yellow envelope that followed, my mother's silence, Elizabeth's 3-word message, and of course the court case, how everything had been woven together, how I had been invisibly destroyed. Sometimes my eyes filled with tears, sometimes the words caught in my throat, but always Lydia waited patiently. A week later, her article was published. The headline was harsh but true. "Daughter left out of inheritance, a family's silent betrayal." Underneath was Lydia's name. The article didn't make me look like a victim. It didn't demonize Elizabeth. It simply wrote the truth, and for the first time I felt like the narrator of a story, not the subject. After the article was published, my life changed. When I entered the courtroom one morning, I realized for the first time that I was not alone. 3 women were sitting in the corner. Their faces were unfamiliar, but their eyes were familiar. At the next hearing, their number was 5, then 8. Women's rights defenders, journalists, law students, maybe those who came just out of curiosity. But they were there, next to me. They were looking at me, watching me. I didn't turn and greet them, but their presence echoed in my heart. It was as if we were breathing together. This visibility gave me new strength, because visibility was the antidote to being ignored. Until that day, I had thought that silence consumed me. But the deepest silence was dissolved when you could hear the silence of others. That day, on my way out, I looked up at the sky. It was gray again, but there was a clarity in it, and that's when I realized this. Sometimes the door that throws you out is actually meant to let you out from the inside. Because sometimes it's only when you're breathing outside that you realize you're suffocating inside, and sometimes when those who threw you out thought they had closed that door forever, you're out there spreading your wings. When I stepped into the courtroom on the day of the second big trial, I was trembling inside, but my body was straight. This time it was Elizabeth on the witness stand, my sister, the one who had carried the title of perfect all my life, the one who always walked in the front, the apple of my mother's eye. But that day she was going on stage alone, and for the first time, she was not next to me, but in front of me. The hall was quiet, only the rustling of paper, the occasional cough and occasional rattling. The judge signaled our lawyer to take her statement. Our female lawyer, Gail, began to ask her questions in short but sharp sentences. Elizabeth Whitman, were you involved in the process of removing Grace Whitman from the family estate? Elizabeth stood strong at first. A stern look, a short no. But Gail continued. Emails, documents, transfers. It was all laid out in front of her, one by one. Elizabeth's eyes widened at first. Then her lips trembled. She swallowed. She looked away. I knew her. She had been raised not to make mistakes, but now that burden had become a chain, not a burden. And finally, the chain broke. Her voice was shaky, but clear. After my father died, my mother wanted Grace kept away from home because she thought she was too independent. There was silence in the courtroom. Even the judge raised his eyebrows. I held my breath. It was as if the storm I had been holding inside for years had broken with that one sentence. Elizabeth lowered her eyes to the floor. Her shoulders slumped, as if for the first time she could not carry her burden. She continued, I was against everything, but I kept silent, because if I kept silent, I would have gotten more of a share. He paused. Then, in a lower but heavier tone, he added, I made a mistake. I neither won nor lost at that moment. But there was a knot inside me, a knot I had tied tightly for years. That knot started to untie. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh either. I just took a deep breath, as if it was my own breath for the first time. It became clear not why they silenced me, but why I would no longer be silent. Because sometimes the greatest victory is when the truth comes out. And sometimes it is to see that even those who silence you are afraid of your own voice. Elizabeth spoke that day, and I grew even more that day. The air in the courtroom was heavier that morning. The crowds of people had thinned, but the silence was thicker, more tense, like a thicker, more tense blanket. Because someone else had come that day. My mother, Evelyn Whitman, for the first time. The living room stirred slightly when she came through the door. She was dressed in black again, just like at the funeral. It was as if she was trapped in a mourning, but I no longer knew who she was mourning for, my father or her own conscience. Her steps were gliding, not pounding on the ground, but she was strong, as always. He sat up straight. His gaze was not on me, but directly at the judge, as if I didn't exist. When the judge called him to the witness stand, a wave of whispers passed, and I didn't move, because I had imagined this moment for years, to see my mother in front of me, defenseless in the face of the truth. Evelyn stood tall on the dais. Her voice was calm, controlled. She spoke as if she was still the family's honorary representative. I have never denied that I am Grace's family. That sentence. It was so empty, so fake. It was as if it was read from a script, not from his lips, as if it was written not in love but in strategy. But this time the silence he was used to was not there. The judge raised his head. He picked up the documents in the file. He adjusted his glasses and asked in a clear, full voice, Ma'am, all property transfers, all signatures, all legal decisions were made in your name. You are the one who transferred all of Grace Whitman's rights and even signed the court applications. I don't quite understand what you don't deny. Silence did not fall in the hall. It fell. But this time, I was not the owner of the silence. My mother's face did not fade, but her lips moved for a moment. She said nothing. No defense came. She swallowed. Then she tilted her head slightly. For the first time, I felt something crack behind her eyelids. There was no sense of triumph, no anger, only clarity. The woman who had been a giant in my eyes for so many years became human, and that person was filled with a broken silence. I was no longer silent. I was telling, I was writing, and my mother— Now he was just listening. My hands were not in my pockets as I walked to the courthouse. I was no longer hiding. My every step was clear. Quiet but determined, the gray jacket I wore that morning was like a kind of armor. It was neither flashy nor unadorned, simple but resilient, just like me. My notebook was in my bag, the blue cover notebook I had been carrying with me since day one. Inside were the dirtiest, quietest, but most real pages of my life. As I put it in my bag, I caressed the cover with my hand for a while. It was as if it was talking. "Are you ready?" The security guard nodded to me as I passed through the metal detector at the entrance to the courtroom. He hadn't recognized me before, but now he did. I was visible now, because I had fought to be visible, because my name was on a petition, a news report, a voice recording. I was no longer an erased girl. I was a woman who proved her existence. When I entered the hall, my eyes immediately fell on the two people in the front row. Claire was sitting up straight, as usual. Next to her was Lydia. Her notebook was on her knees, her pen ready under her thumb. Our eyes met. She smiled, a small, quiet smile. It meant support. It meant faith. It meant, "I'm here." Elizabeth wasn't in the courtroom yet. Her lawyer was reviewing the documents. My mother was sitting alone in one of the back rows. She was wearing black again. She was just lost in that black. She used to wear that color with dignity. Now it was like a shroud over her, a shroud of living silence. With the arrival of the judge, everyone stood up. The wooden benches in the hall creaked. It was as if even he felt the weight of this verdict. We sat down. It was as if my heart was beating not in my chest but in my ears. Everything accumulated towards this moment. Every word, every document, every silence. The judge took the file in front of him. He lowered his glasses to the tip of his nose. He began to turn the pages. The courtroom held its breath. And then he began to speak. The lawsuit filed by Grace Whitman is being considered on the grounds that her inheritance and property rights were transferred improperly. The evidence, witness statements, and documents submitted by the parties have been examined in detail by the court. He paused. There was not even a cough in the hall. It was concluded that the plaintiff was unlawfully deprived of his right of inheritance by his family members. It is clearly understood that the title deed, transfer, and legal transactions were carried out in collusion, hidden from the plaintiff. My eyes fell on Elizabeth's lawyer. He bowed his head. He pretended to be taking notes, but in fact he was hiding. "Therefore," the judge said, "Grace Whitman's claims for possession and damages are granted in part. Proceedings will be taken to reestablish the plaintiff's title to the family home and to redistribute the estate. The judgment is final." It was like someone opened a window into me. I had been sitting in a dark room for years, and suddenly someone opened the curtains wide. Claire's hand reached for my shoulder. She didn't squeeze. She just touched me. It was like a reminder that I was real, that this moment was real. I didn't tear up, because at that moment, silence, not tears, was my biggest reaction. A silence that echoed within myself. You did it. You came back. You have etched your presence in the court records. But I knew this victory was not limited to the court walls. It was proof that a woman cannot be silenced, cannot be erased. I stood up, took my notebook out of my bag, slowly opened the cover, and looked at the first page. I have been erased, but I can still write. And now I added a little note at the end. And you can't erase me anymore. For the first time in a year, I waited in front of a door without feeling cold. The key in my hand didn't feel like it was going to fall out of my hand this time. I was holding it tightly. It wasn't the coldness of the metal that made me tremble, but its meaning. Because this key was not the key to a past where I was excluded, forgotten, silenced. It was the key to a future I had built, chosen, deserved. My new home was small, simple but cozy. It had 2 floors. The front facade was painted white, with light blue shutters on the windows. I fell in love with the wood carving above the door at first sight, a tiny bird carrying a branch in its beak. Maybe it symbolized hope, or the building of a new home. The old apricot tree standing alone in the garden looked like it had just come out of winter. There were still a few yellowing leaves on its branches, but new buds were visible. Just like me, fallen, but determined to bloom again. I took a deep breath. Then I put the key in the lock. I turned it. This time, the door opened. I wasn't excluded. I wasn't pushed. I wasn't rejected. It opened. It clicked open like a warm, friendly hand. When I stepped inside, I smelled a mixture of freshly painted walls and the smell of fresh wood. My furniture had not yet arrived. There was only a table, a chair, and boxes of books in the corner. But the emptiness was not eerie, but hopeful. It was as if the inside of the house was a story in waiting, an unwritten novel. Every wall was a paragraph, every window a comma, every room a new title. I took off my shoes. When I stepped on the wooden floor, the coolness under my bare feet gave me the feeling that I was really here. This place was not temporary. This was a place I had earned with my own labor, not a shelter that had been granted to me. I walked into the kitchen. Freshly stacked plates on the shelves, empty mugs, a bunch of dried lavender, a teapot, and 2 cups on the table. One for me, one for the guest. But there were no guests today. Today it was just me, hosting myself. I took out the notebook I carried with me, which had been my most faithful confidant throughout the war. The cover was worn, the corners folded, some pages crumpled with tears. But it was mine. Every word, every sentence was mine. I opened it and came to the last page. I held the pen in my hand for a while. Before I started writing, I looked at the apricot tree outside, swaying slightly in the wind. It was as if it was nodding to me. And then I wrote, I am Grace Whitman. I was 32 years old. I was abandoned. I was silenced. I was ostracized from where I belonged. But then I wrote myself again. I picked up my pen and wrote, and this time no one could erase me. As I wrote this sentence, a strange silence fell over me. But it was not like the old silence. This silence came not from fear, but from completion, like writing the last line of a book, or when an answer that has been waiting for years is finally given. I thought of my year-long struggle. The lonely nights, Claire's coffee, the cold benches in the courtroom, my mother's silence, Elizabeth's eyes, the journalist's cap, the silent support of the crowd. And finally, the sound of my own feet. I had finally managed to leave my mark on every surface I stepped on. I looked out the window. The sky was turning light blue. A new day was beginning. But this was not one of those days. This was different. This was the day that belonged to me, the starting point of my life. I took out a new notebook from my bag. I opened the cover. On the first page, I wrote a word in capital letters, beginning, and my pen started to slip. This time, I wasn't writing about my life, but about my dreams. I was no longer writing about the past, but about the future. Because this was not just my story. This was the story of all women whose voices were suppressed, whose identity was stolen, who were left in the shadows. I only held a pen, but what was written with that pen was the rebirth of all of us. And this time no one could write the end of my story, because that pen was now in my hand.